Middle Way Philosophy Introductory Video 2A, How Western Philosophy Lost Its Way by Robert M. Ellis. We shouldn't underestimate the effects that philosophy has, or at least might have, on everybody, on the wider public. Philosophy is mainly distinguished by its examination of our most basic assumptions. By doing that, it can help to determine what people's assumptions are, but perhaps most commonly today, it reflects those assumptions. There's thus a triangular relationship between philosophy, the formal study of our assumptions, how those assumptions are handled in education and public debate that help to shape people's understanding, and then the everyday assumptions of ordinary people. Philosophy does sometimes filter through to ordinary people. More often, ordinary people stamp their impressions on philosophy, which formalizes them. Two kinds of strands can be distinguished in Western philosophy from the beginning. One strand is the metaphysical obsession with how things really are or how they are not. We have no access to how things really are or are not. For more on that, see the video number 2 on Scepticism in this series. If you're obsessed with how things really are or are not, then you're likely to come up with speculative claims that end up conflicting with each other. For example, the belief that matter ultimately exists or does not exist, or that God does or does not exist. In reaction to those kinds of conflicting speculative claims, you can also end up with a conventionalist reaction when you just think, oh, well, this is just a complete waste of time, let's go back to what everybody thinks. However, there is a much more useful alternative strand of Western philosophy that has been there from the beginning. It goes back to Socrates, who was perhaps the founder of Western philosophy, and it also goes back to the skeptics, the questions asked by Pyrrho. This strand of philosophy is more concerned with the limitations of our knowledge. It's a strand of philosophy which is of direct practical relevance because it allows us to question every possible assumption that we make. It's shaping of provisional attitudes because, again, we can't take any particular claim for granted. Thus, we can always re-examine what we've taken for granted and thus find ourselves facing up to conditions better before they catch up with us. There have been some figures in Western philosophy who tried to take a largely middle way perspective like that of the Buddha. Pyrrho in ancient times and John Dewey in more recent times are examples of philosophers who've gone quite some way towards a middle way perspective. But Western philosophy has been dominated by the metaphysical strand, the mainstream conceptual obsessives, who, on the whole, dismiss psychology entirely and tried to find a totally conceptual explanation of the world. Where this mainstream tradition has engaged with figures like Pyrrho and Dewey at all, you tend to find that they've been appropriated or misinterpreted. The history of Western philosophy has often been told in terms of the struggle between rationalism and empiricism. The rationalists, represented by Plato and then more recently by Descartes particularly, believed that the whole of reality could be absolutely explained in terms of a conceptual foundation. However, the empiricist tradition challenged that by invoking the senses, by being compatible eventually with science, by using evidence as a support for our knowledge. Aristotle was the leading figure who at least started this process. Hume is another major contributor. One might think that empiricism was closer to the middle way, and in many ways the use of experience does bring it closer to the middle way than the rationalists ever achieved. However, it's quite possible for empiricists also to run into dogmatic assumptions. The trap for empiricists is confirmation bias. If you think that our beliefs are justified by our experience, then you have to take into account the fact that our experience is selective. It's affected by our physical limitations and our wishes. We can thus end up in a loop, a positive confirmation loop. in which we select our experience according to our beliefs. And then, although experience appears to confirm our beliefs, all we've really confirmed is what we previously assumed, which has scoped our experience. Some of the limitations of empiricism were improved upon by a more recent philosophical movement known as Phenomenology. Phenomenologists had a slightly wider view of what experience consisted in than empiricists traditionally did. They were also more inclined to recognise the role of interpretation in understanding that experience. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for example, particularly investigated the relationship of the body and the activity of the body in relation to that interpretation. Other phenomenological thinkers, like Sartre, particularly laid an emphasis on our responsibility for that interpretation, which radically put us in more charge of our lives. However, any advances made by phenomenology in the early 20th century were quickly overhauled by the overbearing rise of analytic philosophy, which, from its origins, particularly in the English-speaking world, from the beginning of the 20th century, has come to totally dominate philosophical discussion within the US and the UK and many other countries. Analytic philosophy has arisen initially from the competition with specialised sciences. So sciences that once counted themselves as part of a wider project known as philosophy have become the preserve of specialised niche workers who look at very, very small segments of knowledge and add a very small amount to each segment of knowledge. In order to compete with them in the academy, philosophy had to find a niche too. That specialised niche for analytic philosophers is analysis. That is, finding out the implications of what we already assume. In specialising in analysis, philosophy simultaneously gave up on synthesis, which is now, in practice, pretty much banned in analytic philosophical circles. It's regarded as necessarily speculative and dogmatic. But synthesis simply means bringing together different beliefs, seeing resemblances between them, uniting and bringing things into dialectical contact with each other, allowing conflicts to be overcome, rather than merely working out the implications of conflicts that already exist. Analytic philosophy, by joining in the scientific project, began to see philosophy as adding small additions to a large body of knowledge. But of course, that body of knowledge had to be then taken for granted. By doing this then, philosophy effectively gave up on big picture arguments. Issues like scepticism, for example, became marginalised, although they're still taught on philosophy courses. Scepticism, in the global sense, allowing every kind of knowledge claim to be questioned, is no longer taken seriously by analytic philosophers. Another effect of the dominance of analytic philosophy has been a great support for relativism in both a scientific and a moral sense. Seeing itself as a handmaiden to science, analytic philosophy has supported and spread the fact-value distinction, which is an almost unquestionable element of all analytic thinking. The fact-value distinction tends to assume that facts have a kind of objectivity or absolute status that values cannot have, values being almost intrinsically subjective. This leads, on the one hand, to a misunderstanding of scientific objectivity, because science is seen as intrinsically factual or true or truth dependent in a way that values are not, which of course gives people unrealistic expectations about the degree of justification for scientific theory. But the other strand of this effect of the fact-value distinction is to see values as intrinsically subjective, that is, only dependent on individual arbitrary positions, whims, and so on. That tends to give rise to conventionalism, that is, the idea that we can't do any better than just to go along with what everybody thinks. We can't really examine it, we can't really justify it in any higher terms than that. So we're left with a choice when it comes to ethics and similar value inquiries. Values are either dogmatic, that is, you take them on faith, or you take them on authority, or on the other hand, they might be relative, that is, they've only arisen in your circumstances, perhaps in your particular social milieu, or they're dependent simply on your desires. But there's no other justification for one moral choice over another. Analytic philosophy, then, systematically represses any kind of middle way thinking that might arise in the general thinking of the population, and particularly those who undertake philosophy. Of course, people could raise middle way kinds of questions and positions in philosophy classes, but nobody ever gets into a position of influence in the philosophical profession if they adopt a middle way style of philosophizing. The reason for this is a set of interrelated kinds of repression. So specialisation, which we've already mentioned, means that there can be no big picture arguments considered. They're considered unrealistic or dogmatic within the analytic philosophy tradition. That is also related to the misunderstanding of scepticism. Scepticism can only be applied in the analytic context to limited kinds of issues or perspectives. There's no genuine even-handed or global scepticism, criticism applied to both sides of a metaphysical debate. That's related to the choice between extremism and conventionalism that we've already noted in relation to values. People can, of course, take extreme kinds of rationalised position, but of course those positions rapidly come to seem impractical and irrelevant. The alternative is just to be extremely conventional in your approach, because you've got no grounds to argue for anything else. The other fourth element of the repression is abstraction. That is, practicality is marginalised analytic philosophy. Not that there's no practical application of philosophy, but it's definitely not at the heart of what analytic philosophy is about and how it works. People don't adopt philosophical positions for practical reasons. They adopt them for entirely abstract reasons, and that's seen as central to the philosophical project. That abstraction arises from the specialisation of the analytic philosopher. His particular job is to be abstract and to define terms very precisely and abstractly. In the process of doing that, the definition and the exploration in conceptual terms becomes practically irrelevant in most cases. To summarise then, how philosophy has lost its way. Philosophy should be questioning all assumptions. Potentially, it can do that. But in practice, many of our assumptions are off limits. At least, even if we're allowed to ask questions about them, those kinds of questions are not seriously explored by philosophers, or philosophers who try to do it won't get any status within the philosophical profession. Philosophy should be an aspect of everyone's lives. Everybody is a philosopher in the sense that everybody has assumptions and everybody can explore those assumptions. But instead, philosophy has become an over-specialised profession. Philosophy should help people to develop both analytic and synthetic skills which are interdependent and rely on each other to be useful. But instead, it focuses only on analytic skills overwhelmingly. Philosophy should help us to see our limitations, but instead it often entrenches those limitations through its conventionalism. It should help us to interpret our experience critically, but instead it tends to abstract from that experience and indeed support us in making dogmatic claims in relation to that experience. Philosophy should help us to take responsibility for our values, but often it makes those values seem arbitrary by relativizing them according to a dualistic kind of structure where you only have two choices between two extremes. But before I finish, let me also suggest how philosophy could be. What philosophy will be like taken in accordance with a middle way kind of approach. In middle way philosophy, we deal with provisional theories about the universal. It's not that the universal is banned, and we're not restricted to analysis. But provisionality is important in dealing with anything that we claim to be universal. A middle way approach to philosophy takes psychology and neuroscience seriously. It doesn't attempt to abstract away from such information or to specialise in a way that excludes it. Nothing is critically off limits when philosophy is properly practiced. And even-handedness is a crucial quality which you really don't see discussed in philosophical circles, but is absolutely crucial in middle way philosophy. Positive alternatives should also accompany any criticism of a particular position. That again, like even-handedness, helps to avoid just getting entrenched in dualisms, in alternative metaphysical beliefs that simply oppose each other. Philosophy should be constantly informed and tested in practice, rather than being basically defined as an abstracted discipline irrelevant to practice. Philosophy should be valued for its creativity and originality, not its immersion in an existing discourse. But at present, anybody who attempts to write and publish philosophy which doesn't really engage in detail in existing discourse and thus accept existing assumptions will be automatically rejected in most cases. Philosophy has a responsibility to serve society by providing a critical perspective. Philosophy could be doing that. At the moment, very generally speaking, it is not.